For those of you who are Orthodox, I hope you had a good Orthodox Easter this weekend. We certainly did over here in Michigan, um, and it was really cool during the vigil service when we're reading the gospel over Christ's tomb to think of this section where Zosima is having the gospel read over his body, and Alyosha has his thoughts. And, I found myself sitting there having thoughts of my own and hearing them mingle with verses from the gospel and how it all kind of put together. So, yeah, it's been really great to be reading this book during Lent and the lead up even before Lent. And then, to be finishing it with you now after Pascha. Um, so yeah, today we get to wrap up um, the discussion about the brothers Karamazov, but this is not the end of the brothers Karamazov. As I mentioned, I had some illnesses in my family that kind of derailed me for a little bit, and I needed to kind of take care of those things and make sure everything was good. So I'm still playing catch up on a few of the essays from last month, but the Alyosha essay should be out in the next day or two. And then, yeah, I'll continue putting those out until the end of the month. And then in the following month, we're going to begin our next book club, or our next book inside of our current book club. Again, we're kind of picking up themes and we're carrying them with us. There was a lot of discussions about freedom, both human and divine, particularly that I covered in the Ivan lecture. But really, the entire book is about freedom and what we do with it and what we're held accountable for. And then we have, the philosopher of, well, there are many philosophers of freedom. Schelling certainly is one of them. But the most popular philosopher of freedom is Friedrich Nietzsche, whose name, is like an old German way of saying like a freed person or someone who's rich with freedom. So we're going to do Nietzsche's Also sprach Zarathustra next, or Thus Spake Zarathustra. And for those of you who are worried, don't be. It is only, about 300 pages, maybe less than that. And we're going to do it over 2 months. So there's 4 parts in there. Zarathustra comes down from the mountain and he wants to give his wisdom to the world. And he's got a lot of really great aphorisms and great imagery. And I'll be digging into that with you for May and June. So we're going to do Nietzsche for that. Kind of, Dostoevsky is always one of the big philosophical heavyweights of, like the end of the previous century and, the century before that. And Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are often talked about in the same breath, sometimes as rivals. And so we get to see a different take of Nietzsche, and then we might actually find that he and Dostoevsky have a lot more in common than most people would have you believe. After that, we'll move into our summer big read. And so this will take us from July into like October or so in there. And that's George Eliot's Middlemarch. Now, Middlemarch is really having, it's had a moment on Substack. Over the past year, I've seen a lot of people talking about it. And so this is our chance, and this is your chance to get into Middlemarch and give this a read. Again, this is a very philosophical book club. I like to do literature that deals with philosophical themes, and I like to do philosophy that's done in a literary way. So I always think of George Eliot as being the philosophical Jane Austen. She was a translator of Leibniz, and I think it was Feuerbach. I need to check on that. But she translated German philosophers, which is not an easy thing to do. And there are plenty of really interesting epigraphs in here that deal with philosophical themes. And so we'll look a little bit at how sympathy and compassion plays a role in tying lives together. And that's a nice balance, I think, to Zosima's understanding of freedom as well. So that will be the big read during the summer. Again, we're going to do Nietzsche, then we're going to do George Eliot. Then in the fall, we're going to do another short book, and that's Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. One of my favorite books that has to deal with it deals with a woman who's dealing with grief. She's not happy with the gods and what they're doing with their freedom. She's not happy with her sister and what she's doing with her freedom. She gets control of her kingdom, or her queendom rather. But can she run it well? Can she run herself well? Can she forgive? Can she reconcile herself to the real world? Can she drop her grievances? This is a beautiful book. Till We Have Faces is one of Lewis's greatest books. And I mean, this is one of my desert island reads. I've often lent this out to people. I've bought copies and given it to people. And I've never heard anyone give me the book back and say I wasn't changed by this. Sometimes I've had some people confused and they're like, I don't know what was going on, but I know that something was going on. So this is your chance to find out what's going on with Lewis, and that'll be in autumn. And then finally, to wrap up the year, we're going to go for an even smaller book. My favorite poet, Rainer Maria Rilke. We're going to be doing Letters to a Young Poet, and these are a handful of really short little letters. You can read this in an afternoon, but you can sit on it for a lifetime. I love Rilke. This is certainly a desert island book for me. I am rereading it constantly. And so this is also his centenary. So he died 100 years ago. And so I thought in December, it would be really fitting to read Letters to a Young Poet to finish out the year and kind of celebrate his life and his being, now 100 years into his legacy. So Letters to a Young Poet is how we're going to finish things. And kind of set the year to go in a more creative direction, I think. Maybe pursue a different theme for next year. But for the time being, we should get back to Dostoevsky and wrap that one up. So, as an aside, this is, the final discussion about Dostoevsky. And naturally, we're going to have spoilers as we talk about the finale of the book. So I'll mention that now, and I will mention it periodically as more people join. But just so you know, we will be discussing how this book ends, and there will be spoilers involved. I'll keep reminding you as we go along. But let's start by looking into chapter 10, or book 10, rather. So how does this thing start? It starts, I think, in a little bit of an unusual spot. So if we remember kind of what was happening before, we had this nice little family in book 1. Then we have the situation at the monastery where we're supposed to make a judgment about what's going on between Dmitri and his dad. A verdict is not really rendered here. It just becomes a clown court. Fyodor makes a fool of himself. Dmitri says, I'm going to kill you. They have to break up the party. So no real justice happens there. Then we met some supporting characters and learned about their grievances. We learned about love triangles. We learned about boys getting into fights and biting Alyosha's hand. Then we had those big philosophical discussions with Ivan and Alyosha. And Ivan with Smerdyakov that deal with all sorts of things about evil and freedom. And then they also deal with what is Ivan going to do now that he knows that things are really ramping up and he knows kind of what the plan is for the death of his father. And of course, the guy who says, I would give up my ticket to this evil world, buys a ticket to get away from his family. So we had those philosophical conversations about evil and between Ivan and Smerdyakov. And then we move to the life of Father Zosima, where we get this glimpse of his whole life and his whole teaching. And all of this was distilled very clearly into the idea that all of creation is paradise, but it will only be realized if you take responsibility for the sins of all unto yourself. And here we also had the surprising thing that Zosima says to Alyosha, "You know why I'm so close to you? Because your brother reminds me of me." Which kind of makes Dmitri feel a little bit more like the protagonist in this novel. The narrator would have you believe that Alyosha is the hero of the story, and maybe he is, you know, in a certain way, not as a traditional hero, I would say. But the connection between Zosima and Dmitri is a really interesting one for how it changes how we look at this novel. But then we come and Alyosha has his chapter where we end with the death of the spiritual father of the novel, Zosima. And then we have this hinge point where Alyosha is kind of on the mountain of the novel. And he needs to think about his father's words, his spiritual father's words. Is he going to believe in his holiness, even though the corpse of Father Zosima smells and everyone has rumors going around that he really wasn't that holy, and that's why he corrupted so fast? What's Alyosha going to do? And he has his beautiful vision of the wedding feast of Cana, and he's resolved that his spiritual father is in heaven and that all is good. And then he's going to follow his obedience to Zosima and go out into the world. And then at that point, the novel switches and we start going downhill. And I've already talked about how some of the things on the way down correspond to what was happening on the way up. So on the one hand, we had Dmitri, that he was in a frantic situation, and the night before he's going a little bit crazy, and then we have the death of his father and the hitting of Grigory on the head with the pestle that he grabbed randomly. And we're left in the dark, really, about what happened there. Literally, the story cuts out for a second during the act of murder. And so it's titled In the Dark, and we're left in the dark. But that kind of corresponds to the death of the father that just happened before. So we have the death of the spiritual father, we have the death of the father. Now, we have a few other things that we're going to fill in today, because on the way down, they don't exactly match, but they do have a tag. So rather than following that, I'm going to follow in narrative order, and then we'll just plug these in as they correspond. So part 4 starts off in a little bit of an odd way, because we had the death of Fyodor, we have the running off to Mokoire with Dmitri going to crash Grushenka's party with her long-lost lover, and then there's a drunken ball going on there. She's not in love with that lover anymore. She's totally with Dmitri. And then the police show up and arrest Dmitri for the death of his father. And during that time, we also got an insight into the backstory of how did they come to this with the preliminary investigation. And that's where you can really start to see that the novel is operating on the second half of the story like a mystery novel, where it starts with a violent, transgressive action, and then gradually we're going to piece together what happened. And then the truth is going to come to light. There's going to be a confession. There's going to be some kind of justice restored at the end, or at least that's how it works in a traditional mystery novel. And so that's kind of what our expectation is for the second part. And so rather than coming right back into the Dmitri story and the investigation that's going on with this, um, instead we catch up with the boy narrative on the other side. So we had the schoolboys, um, Ilushka, um, who bit Alyosha's finger, and he is the son of Whisk Broom or Lufa, or I don't know what your translation has as a name, but his name is Snigirov. And so at this point, we're going to pick up on the story about the boys. What's going on with them? Why were they introduced before? Well, now we're going to get the response to that here. Um, and we get a lot of backstory on Kolya, which I think is a little, when I read it again, I thought, wow, that's really interesting to be putting a new character in that we need to learn more backstory on. I mean, we're in the last quarter of the novel. Can't we start wrapping things up? And yet here Dostoevsky is introducing us to yet another character. So I could see that would be maybe a little bit trying for someone who's trying to keep the dramatis personae in their head this whole time. But we learn about this Kolya character, and what do I think is interesting about him? Well, Kolya, he's a precocious boy, and why do I think that he's introduced here? I think that his story is a little bit of a microcosm. I think that he's a little bit of a microcosm of the brothers. On the one hand, like Dmitri, he's a bit of a daredevil. He lays down on the tracks as the train is going over. He has a reputation of, you know, being charismatic and courageous and brave and foolhardy, even. But he's also very intelligent. He's read his dad's library, and that kind of makes him like an Ivan. But the one thing that's missing here is that does he have Alyosha's desire to reconcile with people? And here we get to see that he does. I think that this whole story about seeds, and as things are passed on to another generation and we all influence each other, the interesting thing about the Kolya story is we get to ask the question, is this chaos going to be passed on to another generation? And it seems that there's some hope that it won't be. It seems that this kid, who is a microcosm of the Karamazovs, he isn't going to perpetuate the violence. He isn't going to perpetuate the conflict. He isn't going to play the blame game. How does he work into the story? Well, we know that he's in here because Ilushka stabbed him with a penknife. And so you would expect, like, he would retaliate or something, he would turn it into a grudge. But this is a story where we get to see that there's more layers going on here than we might imagine. Um, Ilushka has this whole story that can only be revealed through Kolya. So let's talk a little bit about what that backstory is. So the thing is, Ilushka learned from Smerdikov this nasty trick. Remember, Smerdikov was introduced to us in the novel earlier in the first half by killing a cat. And he would hang these cats, and then he would have a mock funeral for them. And so this guy taught Ilusha to take a pin and put it inside of a piece of bread, and then the dog will eat it, and then it'll choke on the pin, and he'll suffer or he'll die or something. So he teaches this trick to the poor boy, and then his dog Zhushka eats it, and he is yelping and crying, and he runs away, and then Ilushka has to deal with the guilt of I killed my dog. He does not enjoy animal cruelty in the way that Smerdikov did. He did not like that seed that was sown in him. And so this shame, really manifests itself as an adrive, to go back to what we've talked about in book 4, he has this strain on him. And so Kolya is a little bit of a big brother kind of figure to Ilushka. And Kolya, as much of a daredevil and whatnot as he is, he cannot condone this animal cruelty. And so he has to shun Ilushka for what he did. And Ilushka, now that he's been cut off and isolated from his friend group, he doubles down and he takes it really badly. And this is what caused that incident earlier about stabbing him with the penknife. And it's interesting in the story that we learn that Kolya didn't retaliate when he got stabbed. He knows that it was hard for him to distance himself from Kolya or from Ilushka for what he did to the dog. But he was willing to take that kid's suffering on himself. Like Alyosha, he knows that this kid was lashing out at him and biting him, on his finger, just in the same way as Kolya knows that this kid is lashing out at me and stabbing me with a penknife. And in both cases, they don't retaliate, but they let Ilushka get this pain out, and they take it unto themselves. And that taking the pain of others onto yourself is a major theme of the novel. So it's interesting that here we see this worked into his story. Now, Ilushka becomes sick, and this is after the penknife incident. Things are not going well for him. It's not looking like he's going to recover from this. And his sickness, it softens his father, who before his father was too proud to accept the charity of others. But now Whisk Broom will accept the 200 rubles from Katya and use it for his family. And we see this softening of people again earlier on in the Zosima chapter, where Markel becomes ill, and he suddenly starts to pray. He becomes more devout. He listens to kind of the wisdom of his mother, and then sows a seed in his brother that will come to fruition later. So people are really transformed by people on their deathbeds here. They're very attentive, and they can reverse people's vices. So that's one thing that we see here. And so after ostracizing Ilushka for what he did to the dog, Kolya decides that now is the time to officially reconcile with Ilushka, to drop this thing, let him know that he can go in peace. We're all good now. And the way that he does that is showing up with this dog, Pereshvan. And Pereshvan is actually his dog, Zhushka. Kolya found him, that he had spat up the bread that had the pin in it, so he didn't actually die. And so that's his last gift, is not only does he give, forgiveness to, not only does Kolya give forgiveness to Ilushka for what he did to the dog, but he even gives the dog back to him. And from here, we can also see, this is a story that's tied up nicely. The thing that happened earlier in part 1, where we saw this violent boy, lashing out at Alyosha, he's obviously got some things wrong at his home. We didn't know if it was just the shame that he had of his father getting into fights with Dmitri, if it was because his father, didn't have enough money to support. But here we also see that he had a shame of his own that he carried. He didn't like what he did to that dog, and he didn't like that he was cut off from his friend group. But here we see that was answered in the second half of the novel, and that the boys are okay with one another. And then here we also see Kolya looking up to Alyosha, and we can clearly see that he admires Alyosha, and maybe he was even inspired by Alyosha to do the forgiveness that he did here. And he listens to Alyosha, for instance, multiple times throughout the novel. He calls doctors swindlers, and he calls them leeches. And then when one of the doctors comes to look at Ilyushka when he's in his helpless state, he repeatedly calls him a leech. And Alyosha tells him to, knock that off. And he does. So it's clear that even though Kolya is not a perfect person or anything like this, he admires Alyosha and he's willing to listen to him. And I was talking with some people, and they have this pet theory that Kolya is actually, his admiration of Alyosha and his following Alyosha's story and his wanting to articulate what a great guy this Alyosha character is he actually became the narrator. That Kolya is the narrator. It's an interesting thought. I haven't messed around with it too much. I guess maybe it's there. You could see that. But again, we also don't have the second half of the novel, which Dostoevsky was planning to write. But yeah, I think that's what I really take away from the boys chapter, is that we see that sometimes children are suffering. We don't know why. We didn't know if it was from external circumstances or a personal shame. And here, with a story about a boy and his dog, we learned, that it can be both, and that children are really complex people in how they carry shame and pain. But even other children can step up and reconcile with them. Even other children can step up and heal relationships with them. So I thought it's a little bit of a micro story, but I think it's an important one because he manifests the main theme of the novel, that we can see people when they're suffering, we can take their pains upon us, we can be reconciled to them. And yeah, so this is a story that's tied together well. So I really enjoyed that little section. So what did you guys think about the boys chapter? Or tell me anything more about part 4. I see some more people are joining here. So feel free to just do a general introduction. Where are you coming from? How's your reading going? What are you enjoying from the book? So it doesn't have to be just about the boys, but give me any questions you have about part 4 or about the brothers Karamazov in general. I'm happy to turn this more into a conversation. All right. So, because we are discussing part 4, this is yet another point where I need to remind you that this is the finale of the book, and thus there will be spoilers. And there's certainly going to be some spoilers in this section. Brother Ivan Fyodorovich. It's interesting on the titles, isn't it? That you have Alyosha gets called Alyosha. He doesn't get called Alyoshenka. He doesn't get called Alexei, or anything like that. He gets called Alyosha. And then Dmitri's chapter, he doesn't get called Dmitri. He gets called Mitya, which is, another version of his name. But then here, Ivan doesn't get called Ivan. He doesn't get called Vanya. He gets called Brother Ivan Fyodorovich, which sounds, I don't know, very formal. It sounds formal. It sounds almost patronizing. Maybe it even sounds clerical, like this is Brother Lawrence, this is Brother Jehoshaphat, whatever. This is Brother Ivan, you know. I don't know why he chose that title, but I just want to call out that I noticed it. And maybe someone who has better Russian than I do can point out what they think that might be. So let's see. So far we've tagged back on the boys chapter, and that one is tied up. The death of the fathers is tied up. Now, what is the Ivan section? Well, this ties back to book 5. So the pro and contra. Ivan was pro, contra, back and forth. He was talking about God creating the world and him having his rebellion against him, for creating such a world where such evil exists. Then, on the other hand, Ivan was also talking about he's against, kind of the church and how they distort the gospel, and how if Christ were to show up, he wouldn't. He would be locked up by this church that claims to be working in his name. And then we also had these conversations between Ivan and Smerdyakov, where Smerdyakov is telling him everything that's going to happen between Fyodor and Dmitri. And then Ivan decides, I'm just going to leave. I'm going to wipe my hands clean of this. I want to be absolved of my freedom and my culpability. I want nothing to do with this bloody mess. And he took off and called himself a scoundrel for doing so. So, Book 11 plugs in and answers to that section. And I think I can... I can break out my prop for this one too. So, the Ivan section comes to here where we're talking about the evil conversations. Both conversations about evil and conversations with evil people. And so that's what's corresponding here in chapter 11, or book 11, I should say. So, interesting thing here that I want to call out, that we don't really see much of what's going on here, but Lisa kind of just turns. Just kind of happens really quickly. Where the last time we saw her, she was a little girl in a wheelchair who was kissing her novice monk betrothed Alyosha. And then she shows up again in a chapter called Little Demon. And she is the little demon, the titular little demon here. And she says some really ghastly things. Let's see if I can get the exact quote for you. So here, Alyosha is no longer a monk, and they are no longer an item. But she just says, let's see, I want terribly to set fire to the house, Alyosha, to our house. Why still don't you believe me? Why shouldn't I? There are even children about 12 years old who want very much to set fire to something, and they want to set fire to things. It's a sort of illness. And then, let's see, she says, I just don't want to do good. I want to do evil, and illness has nothing to do with it. Why do evil? Alyosha asked her. So that there will be nothing left anywhere. Ah, how good there would be if there would be nothing left. You know, Alyosha, I sometimes think about doing an awful lot of evil things, all sorts of nasty things, and I'd do them on the sly for a long time, and suddenly everyone would find out. They would all surround me and point their fingers at me, and I would look at them all. That would be very pleasant. Why would it be so pleasant, Alyosha? Who knows? Maybe the need to smash something good. Or as you said, to set fire something. That also happens. So she wants to do evil, and she wants there to be nothing. For those of you that have read Faust, this is how the devil essentially introduces himself to Faust. He says, who are you? Why did you show up? What's your name? And he says, I am a piece of that spirit that wills evil, but always does good. Hold on, I need to do it in German, because then I can remember it easier. Nun gut, wer bist du denn? Ich bin ein Teil von jeder Kraft, der stets das Gute will und stets das Gute schafft. So I'm this part of that spirit that wills to do evil, but always ends up doing good. Was ist mit diesem Rätselwerk gemeint? Ich bin der Geist, der stets verneint, und das mit Rätseln, denn alles, was entsteht, ist wert, dass es zugrunde geht. Alles, was du böse Zerstörung oder Kurzsünde nennt, das ist mein eigentliches Element. So, I am the spirit that denies. Everything deserves to go to the ground. Everything deserves to go to nothing. Everything that you call sin, destruction, or evil, that's my unique element. So that's how Faust's devil introduces himself. I'm the spirit that denies. Nothing is worth this. It needs to be destroyed. And here we see the same words show up in the little demon of Lisa. Someone who seems so cute. Someone who seems so promising. And then she says, I have this book here. I read in it about a trial somewhere that a Jew first cut off all the fingers of a 4-year-old boy and then crucified him on a wall, nailed him with nails and crucified him, and said at the trial the boy died quickly, only in 4 hours. Quickly. He said the boy was moaning, that he kept moaning, and he stood and admired it. That's good. Good, Alyosha says. Good. Sometimes I imagine that it was I who crucified him. He hangs there moaning, and I sit down facing him, eating pineapple compote. I like pineapple compote very much, don't you? Who is this girl? I mean, she got crazy. She turned like overnight. She's healed, she's up, she's walking around, she had her glow up. She's too good for Alyosha now. Maybe she liked him better when he was a monk because it was more blasphemous to be interested in him. But now we see some bad seeds have started to grow in her, and it's very unsettling, reading the things that she says. But I did it anyway. Let's see. So I'll take a little break here. Lisa, my reading is going slowly, so I appreciate your talks and writings as they help frame the parts I'm about to read. Also, reading this for the second time is a very different experience, which I'm enjoying. Yes, the first time can go, very slowly, and I think most people don't finish it on their first attempt. And so, yes, the first one is largely just about getting the facts down, getting exposed to the story, gleaming what you can as you go through the story for the first time. And, a few quotes here and there, a few images, a few events will stick with you. But you really need another read, I think, to digest it. And that's one reason why I don't mind getting my writings out after we do this conversation here, because we get to workshop a few ideas, we get to think a little more, and then I'll give you, a more polished essay so that you can revisit the story in your memory. You can grab your book and compare with your marginalia. So yeah, thanks for the comment there, Lisa, and thanks for reading. So I'm glad to write more and do more books with you all. So feel free to ask any other questions as I'm going along. So then we have, I don't want to get too hung up on this, but we do have this really beautiful section from Dmitri where he talks about this hymn in a secret, and he has this hymn um, inside of the jail in the prison cell, and he talks about like how even there in the mines underground you can find a human heart in the convict and the murderer standing next to you, and you can be close to him because there too it's possible to live and love and suffer. You can revive and resurrect the frozen heart in this convict. You can look at it after him for years and finally bring up from the cave into the light a soul that is lofty now, a suffering consciousness. You can revive, and we're all guilty, or you can revive, sorry, you can revive an angel, resurrect a hero. And there are many of them, there are hundreds of them, and we are all guilty for them. Why did I have a dream about a wee one once at such a moment? Why is the wee one poor? It was a prophecy to me at the moment. It's for the wee one that I will go, because everyone is guilty for everyone else, for all the wee ones, because there are little children and big children. All people are wee ones, and I go for all of them, because there must be someone who will go for all of them. I didn't kill Father, but I must go, and I accept. So here we see this this willingness in Dmitri, which again, it corresponds to the Zosima section. So in the Zosima section, we saw that Zosima had his revelation that he wants to repent of the sin that he's done. He feels really bad about slapping Afanasi in the face. He feels really bad about dragging this innocent man into a duel. But he knows that he can't back out of the duel because then everyone will assume that he did it out of cowardice. And so instead, he's willing to suffer the consequences of the duel that he asked for. And here we also see in Dmitri, like Zosima, he is willing to take unto himself the consequences of everything he asked for. And like Zosima and Markel and Mikhail, he also knows that it's not necessarily something that he did, but that he can take this suffering and this pain unto himself for everyone. He can develop in him what he calls a suffering conscience, or a suffering consciousness. But really, what's the difference in this case, And with a suffering consciousness, he can be united to everyone. He can take the sins of all unto himself. He can make the world a better place by taking this pain from them. And he's willing to do that. So, when people are asking him, like, why would you, like, wouldn't you want to escape? Don't you want to get off free? And he's like, why would I want to escape? Why would I want to escape from my cross, my crucifixion, Why would I want to get out of this? This is what's going to be the salvation for me and for other people. And, maybe some people think it's a impractical idea, but it's one that Dmitri is certainly convinced of, and it's allowed him to be reconciled to a life most of us would not choose for ourselves. So we see that his story, he is growing more. He's manifesting the Zosima, guilty on behalf of all, so that the world might be paradise. And as we see that he is maturing in this spiritual realization, this is also interspersed with his brother Ivan, who is having some worse conversations. And specifically, he has 3 of them with Smirnikov, where first of all, he calls out Smirnikov, and he says, hey, that was really odd how you foretold that you were going to have an attack at a certain day, at a certain time, which I don't think that you could do. And then he comes back, and, well, before I go there, this might be a good point to pause and tell you that there are spoilers in this conversation. And so, if you would like the story not to be spoiled, as much as I would hate to see you go, this might be a good time for you to do that. So, with that said, I will continue. So, Ivan goes again to Smerdikov and he says, that they're talking about the death of Fyodor, but now this time Smerdikov tells him, you said that you wanted your father killed and then you left town. And so really you're culpable for this, and you knew what was going to happen. And Ivan has this realization and he said, you did it. And Smerdikov smiles. When I read that, I was just struck. And, reading it again, it just never stops to like surprise me, that he didn't say, yes, I did it. He didn't say, oh, you got me. He didn't have some clever thing. He just smiled. That's what I find so unsettling about this novel, is when some people are confronted with their own evil that they've been engaged in, that they would respond with a smile and say that they enjoyed it. Smerdikov's gotten under my skin from day one. He's gotten under Ivan's skin since day one, and he is still getting under Ivan's skin in this section. And so let's see. But so when he learns this, when he sees Smerdikov's smile, he goes back to Katya. Now, Katya has an interesting thing here. Who's she going to be? Who's she going to help out here? Is she going to help out Dmitri, who hasn't been so good to her, who ran off with Grushenka, the Dmitri that broke off an engagement with her? She's already kind of strained. And then Ivan, still wants her to help out Dmitri and to, be a good witness. And so there's a question of, is Katya going to be her savior or destroyer? And during this whole thing, we see that Ivan's guilt about his being complicit in his father's murder is growing even more. And so now the question becomes not just, is Katya going to, defend her fiance Dmitri in this case, but also, given the choice, who would she defend more, Ivan or Dmitri? And it comes to light that she has a drunken letter from Dmitri where he lays out his plans to kill his father. And she reveals this to us right as Ivan is beating himself up the most about how he knew that his father was going to die. He knew who was going to do it, and he decided to take off anyway. And then she says, I have this letter. Dmitri's fate is signed by his own hand. These are his plans that he, this is a premeditated murder. He cannot be held any more guilty than this. But then Ivan leaves and he goes to see Smerdikov for a third time. And then he calls out Smerdikov yet again, for what he did. And Smerdikov, just to confirm things even more so, he pulls out from a stocking the $3,000 or the 3,000 rubles from that night that they were all fighting about. And he sets them in front of Ivan, and he he says that, yep, it was just three people who did it. It was you, it was me, and it was Providence. It was you and me and Providence. That somehow God is complicit in this too, which again is, a part of this whole story is who is responsible for the sins of everyone. And, here, how complicit is Ivan in his father's murder? How complicit is God in creating a world where this kind of murder exists? Here we see that book 11 is tying back to book 5. The Ivan monologues, the chickens there have come home to roost in this section. And then, Smirnikov tells him, and Mark, you just joined, so I need to say it again. There are spoilers here. So if you're going to stay on, you need to know that. Just because I don't want to ruin the book for you if you are still working on it. So that being said, what does he say? I was the means, but you were the murderer. And then Ivan says, well, we're going to go to the trial and we're going to confess it tomorrow, you and me. And there's an interesting side note that on his way to see this guy, who I won't name in case you forgot, and I don't want to spoil things, Ivan saw a drunk peasant in the snow, and on the way back from this kind of confrontation, he said he picks him up and saves him. So that's a nice kind of charitable moment from Ivan, that you can see that he has this pain and this guilt that he's dealing with, and what does he do? Is he does something to relieve someone else's suffering. But then he goes back to his house, and then we have the biggest evil conversation, which kind of parallels, I would say, maybe the Grand Inquisitor, and not exactly, because Ivan, it's a little bit more of a dialogue, but Ivan has a vision of the devil, and the devil shows up in his apartment. And it's always so interesting to me how people portray the devil in literature. I mean, you have Dante, where the devil is, frozen in ice, chewing traitors. You have, Milton, who has an anti-hero, Satan, who is very charismatic, very Byronic, and you almost feel bad for the guy. And he's portrayed in a very resplendent, triumphant light with lots of wings and stuff like that. Then you have Faust, who I mentioned earlier in the conversation today. The Mephistopheles shows up and says, I am the spirit that denies. I just want to destroy things. I'm anti-being. I want things to be undone. I want things to go to the ground. And so how does Dostoevsky introduce us to the devil? I think it's interesting that the first thing he says is he's not very fashionable. Or rather, he was in fashion at some time, but now his clothes look a little dated. And I thought that was a very telling, kind of touch to make fun of the devil's fashion sense. Because by saying that he was out of fashion, he was obviously well-to-do. He looked like a landowner or, something like this. But he seemed, now he's not in fashion. Those look good back then, but it would be like showing up with a powdered wig, or a tux to your friend's dinner today, where you would just be like, wait, hold on, I'm not impressed by what you just did. And in fact, you should be a little embarrassed that you are, trying to show up like this. And he also mentions, like his clothes are a little bit worn, a little bit threadbare. He hasn't let go of this past fashion. And I think that's interesting because, um, like if you're going to portray the devil as like an owner of serfs who's now out of fashion, um, it kind of says that, maybe the devil's kingdom isn't as good as it once was. You know, maybe the serfs that once served him no longer serve him. Maybe he lives on empty land and, he's got to clean his own floorboards now. So that I felt like there was a lot that was being said by just making fun of the devil for wearing an out of date fashion. But what kind of devil is this though? Aside from how he dresses, he's also a very interesting character because Pache, Faust, and Milton and Dante. Dostoevsky's devil says, I really wish that I could. I wish that I could just be a fat woman in church lighting candles and saying prayers and doing all this stuff. But darn it, I just have this role that I need to do. So what does he say, verbatim? He says, by some pre-temporal arrangement, which I have never been able to figure out, I am appointed to negate. Remember, I'm the spirit that denies from Faust. Whereas I am sincerely kind and totally unable to negate. No, they will say, go and negate. Without negation, there will be no criticism. And what sort of journal has no criticism section? Without criticism, there would be nothing but Hosanna. But Hosanna alone is not enough for life. It is necessary that this Hosanna pass through the crucible of doubt, and so on in the same vein. I don't meddle with any of that, by the way. I didn't create it, and I can't answer for it. So they chose themselves a scapegoat. They made me write the criticism section, and life came about. They made me do the criticism, and life as we know it came about. We understand this comedy. I, for instance, demand simply and directly that I be destroyed. Again, I'm the spirit that denies, and I wish I could destroy myself. No, they say, live, because without you there would be nothing. If everything on earth were sensible, nothing would happen. Without you there would be no events, and there must be no events. And there must be events. And so I serve grudgingly for the sake of events, and I do the unreasonable on orders. People take this whole comedy for something serious, despite all their undeniable intelligence, and that is their tragedy. Well, they suffer, of course, but still they live. They live really, not in fantasy, for suffering is life. Has there ever been more of a Russian novel phrase than that? Suffering is life. But I go on. Without suffering, what pleasure would there be in it? Everything would turn into an endless prayer service, holy but a bit dull. And me, I suffer, and still I do not live. I am an X in an indeterminate equation. I am some sort of ghost of life who has lost all ends and beginnings, and I have finally even forgotten what to call myself. So, all right, sympathetic devil, but he raises some interesting questions. What would happen if there was no criticism? What would happen if there was no suffering? There's something really deep in Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky discovered something deep in human psychology, I should say, where if everything was perfect, we would break something just to make something new happen. That's something profoundly wrong with us. And then here we kind of see it in the devil's own mouth. And then he goes on and he calls out Mephistopheles, and Faust, and says, that I desire evil and yet only do good, which I quoted earlier. Well, let man do as he likes. It's quite the opposite with me. I am perhaps the only man in all of nature who loves the truth and sincerely desires good. I was there when the Word who died on the cross was ascending into heaven, carrying on his bosom the soul of the thief who was crucified to the right of him. I heard the joyful shrieks of the cherubim singing and shouting, Hosanna, and the thundering shout of rapture from the seraphim, which made heaven and all creation shake. And I swear by all that's holy, I wanted to join the chorus and shout Hosanna with everyone else. It was right on my lips. It was already bursting in my breast. But you know, I'm very sensitive and artistically susceptible. But common sense, oh, it's the most unfortunate quality in my nature, kept me within the due bounds even then, and I missed the moment. For what? I thought that at the same moment, what will happen after my Hosanna? Everything in the world will immediately be extinguished, and no events will occur. And so, solely because of my official duty and my social position, I was forced to squash the good moment in myself and stay with my nasty tricks. Wow. I mean, I don't know how much you should allow the devil to self-justify. But I think there's something in us that would agree with him, that we want some drama, we want someone to hate, we want an antagonist, we want to be against someone, we want to make our problem someone else's problem. And the devil says, I exist as a necessary negative, and I will take all of those, I will take the sins of all unto myself. So it's interesting how the devil is taking the Zosima, take the sins of all unto yourself thing, and he kind of like inverts it once it's passed through Ivan's Euclidean mind that needs to have everything be orderly and straight. But it gets really warped, when it comes out of his mouth. But I think it's a very entertaining chapter. I don't know, maybe there's something wrong with me, but I think it's more entertaining than terrifying. But maybe there's something wrong with all of us. And once again, as a plug for our upcoming book club, he does mention that the world has been destroyed and rebuilt an infinite number of times. And then he also talks about like a man god that, will need to ascend. And so in here, you can kind of see out of the devil's mouth two of Nietzsche's really big ideas of, the Übermensch and eternal return kind of seated in here. So we'll pick up those themes when we talk about Nietzsche later on. But it was interesting to see them come out of the devil's own mouth. Now, what happens when he throws the glass and then Alyosha at the devil vanishes, Alyosha knocks at the door, and Alyosha tells them the news that Smerdyakov hanged himself. So I love how it ends kind of on a cliffhanger right there. Not exactly a cliffhanger, Ivan is telling him everything that the devil was telling him. It's clear that there is something inside of Ivan's very regimented mind that is starting to unravel. And then we're going to see that definitely unravel in the next part. So pause before we go into book 12. Once again, throw it your way and, give me any questions that you have, any comments. You can tell me, where are you from? Where do you live? What other books are you reading? What books are you looking forward to reading? It doesn't just have to be about Dostoevsky right here. So this is, an open floor. If you have any other comments, throw them my way, and then I can be sure to, pick those up as we go along or at the end. But now we're coming into the final stretch. The chapter 12 and the epilogue. And so here we're dealing with the judicial error. And so it's pretty clear from the title that justice is not going to be served, or the proceedings are not going to go as planned. And so it's interesting, again, how did we start this book? One of the first things that happened in the plot was that the family shows up at the monastery to have the issue between Fyodor and Dmitri sorted out by the judge, Father Zosima. That does not happen. It becomes a mess. So we've seen all of these parallels along the way. What do you think is going to happen, in the judicial error section? I think it's pretty clear that, again, justice is not going to be served. Something's going to go wrong in this courtroom. Maybe many things are going to go wrong, just as they went wrong the first time they tried to deal with this. One of my big takeaways from this section is that kind of meta point, that in Dostoevsky's novel, he doesn't have a very good opinion of courts. He doesn't have a very good opinion of human justice. He thinks that we overesteem our ability to determine who is guilty and who is innocent. We've seen this in this story, where the entire point is about that figuring out who is innocent and who is guilty is often a nonsensical question, because none of us can be proven innocent, especially if you're doing life right. If you're doing life right, you make yourself guilty for all on behalf of all. That's the big thesis for this. But then you can even take another one of his novels, like Crime and Punishment, where the judge and the jury, they don't sort out the murder case and figure out who's really innocent and who's guilty in this murder. It takes Raskolnikov's conscience to do that. Justice can be fooled easily, and that should be really, that should give us pause. But the thing is, the conscience is not as easily fooled. And so let's see kind of what happens in these proceedings. So Dmitri shows up. He's looking dandy, and he says that he is pleading not guilty to murder and theft. He'll be guilty of everything else in this world, but at least not those two. At least not in terms of human justice. And we have some mutterings that maybe, Dostoevsky sets the scene. People are talking about new ideas and new feelings, that a more modern liberal sense might acquit Dmitri for these things, based on external circumstances, or it can be understandable. It was a fit of passion, And then it's interesting that the witnesses, like the guy who was running the hotel in Makore, he doesn't do a good job of representing himself. When they really start to interrogate him, they were like, how do you know how much money he was waving around? He's like, well, I think I know. And they're like, I don't think you do. And so a lot of the witnesses don't do a good job of representing themselves during the proceedings, which I guess makes Dmitri look, like in a little bit of a better light. Then we have the medical expertise section, where you have the German Herzenstube, and he says, oh, Dmitri's out of his mind. And then you have the Moscow doctor who says, like, oh, this was a fit of passion. And then Vavinsky, I think it's interesting that he followed up and he just said, oh, no, he's a totally normal person. And they're like, oh, so does that mean that he did it? He's like, I don't know, I guess anyone could. Or, like that you have these three things, It's either you're out of your mind, you're overrun by passion, or maybe anyone can just kill their dad. And then there's this really charming moment with Herzenstube where he says, despite him being out of his mind, I remember when he was a kid and I gave him a pound of nuts and taught him how to say the glory be in German. And there was this touching moment between Dmitri, where he looks at the old doctor and the old doctor looks at him, and the old doctor sees him as the young kid that he was. And there's this nice little innocent moment, which was kind of the parentheses to that was it mentioned that Russian history is about people weeping and laughing at the wrong times. And that brings up another theme that kind of happens through this is it's not so much yes, of course it's Dmitri's story, but there's also a lot of talking about the Russian spirit and what should be expected in Russian culture when it comes to who's guilty and who's innocent, and should courts be forgiving people. And the prosecutor has his Russian troika where he wants to talk about how the Karamazovs are, just three aspects of Russian culture, like one, their ingenuity, one is attracted to Europe, and one is their popular pietistic foundations. It's interesting how, these characters are really playing into that this is not just one family drama, but this is representing a drama happening in Russian society at this time, which is an interesting take. But I personally am more interested in how this is a universal human story. So it's interesting to see the prosecutors come at this, in a little bit of a Russian society perspective. But I personally like the philosophical and the theological ones that are trying to make more meta points out of this family drama. So I covered, a lot about that. And then we have this section called the sudden catastrophe. And so what is this sudden catastrophe? Well, so Alyosha, Katya, Grushenka, they all come in and do pretty good defenses of Dmitri. But then in comes Ivan. And Ivan is laughing to himself. He's pretty out of his mind. The guy just had a conversation with the devil the night before, so I don't know if I would fare much better in his shoes. So Ivan has cracked. And he's walking around, and then he pulls out the money that he got from Smerdikov, the 3,000 rubles that all of this was supposed to be about. And he put it forward, as he's saying, like, oh, well, really, I got this from him, and he killed him, but I'm the real murderer, But then again, doesn't everyone want to kill their father? And I'm sure that's why Freud said Dmitri is the best Dostoevsky is the best psychologist, because he, talks about people wanting to kill their fathers. So Freud went on to make his entire career, out of that one line from Ivan, essentially. But so when Ivan is putting this damning evidence, damning on him, damning for Smerdikov, but Smerdikov isn't there anymore because he killed himself. But Katya, she makes her allegiance known in this moment. And just as previously, Dmitri bailed her out and she was totally reliant on him. Now she has the chance to bail him out. He's entirely reliant on her. And what does she do? She lays out the evidence. The letter that he wrote while drunk, I think at the Metropolitan Pub House. And it has all of his premeditated plans for how he wants to kill his dad. And this is very damning for Dmitri. he can't get out of it. These are his own words. This is his plan. This is how he wants to do it. And she resolved this love triangle between her and Ivan and Dmitri. And she chose Ivan in his broken state where he wants to damn himself. He wants to take responsibility for his role in his father's death. And, a thing I neglected to mention earlier is Ivan had this idea that if God is dead, then everything is permitted. And this was an intellectual game for him. It was an intellectual idea. He toyed around with it. But Smerdyakov took that idea and put it into action. He said, I was the means, but you're the murderer. And so Ivan's dealing with this guilt. And maybe he wants to, go with Dmitri and, take this punishment on him. There's a weird sense in which punishment can be a little bit cathartic to a guilty conscience. Obviously, punishment can be abused because we're not good at determining out how to measure culpability and how to measure punishment. But there is some kind of sense where the guilty conscience wants the punishment because it wants correction. It wants justice to be restored, and it wants the bone to be reset so that things can heal. And so, just as Ivan is wanting to go in this direction, Katya intervenes in the natural process and puts down that letter. And Dmitri, he's good for the mines at this point. She spared Ivan. People are saying he's too insane to even really be sorted out here, but Dmitri is still on trial. So the prosecutor does his big thing that, he's talking about, what this shows us about the Russian spirit. He also mentions that Smerdyakov, couldn't have done it because Smerdyakov doesn't have a motive. And it's interesting that he entertains the idea that Dmitri wanted to commit suicide for no reason, but that Smerdyakov couldn't commit suicide for no reason. I don't know. It was weird how he was giving Smerdyakov a pass on this one, but a lot of the things that he applied to Dmitri could easily have been applied to Smerdyakov. But the takeaway from the prosecutor, one of the famous lines from the novel that I think is, he talks to the Europeans, and he's saying, you Europeans have your Hamlets, but we have our Karamazovs. And I think that is just one of my favorite lines. Because if you've ever read Hamlet, he is in his head. He is a fascinating character that's thinking about all sorts of philosophical ideas. And then he's getting into, fights with his uncle. And he's pondering death and all of this. And it's absolutely right on brand. These are all the same things that that the brothers Karamazov want to talk about. And so that line, you have your Hamlets, but we have our Karamazovs, is one to really take and think about. So what does the defense have to say to this, as kind of the final spin here? Well, it's interesting that he points out that, the prosecutor doesn't really like Dmitri because the prosecutor's wife likes to flirt with Dmitri because she knows that it makes her husband annoyed. So it's interesting. He's doing this whole grand thing about Russian society and what this Karamazov trial is. And he makes this big convincing thing. And then the defense attorney, kind of points out that he's got a personal vendetta happening in here. So I thought that was funny. He also points out that, he's using all sorts of psychology to figure out what's going on with Dmitri, but he says that psychology is a stick with both ends. You can use it to define both. They need Dmitri to be calculating, and they need him to be sloppy. But they don't say he's all one or the other. So he's putting good holes in the prosecutor's case. And then he also points out that there's no money. No one's found the money with, blood on it in an envelope, that would be damning. The only person who showed up with any money was Ivan, and we've already discredited him. And so then there's the final part where he picks up on Smerdyakov, where they were like, oh, well, Smerdyakov, in his letter, or whatever, he didn't confess to the sin, or he didn't confess to the murder of Fyodor. And the defense attorney has this really interesting thing that he says. And he said, yeah, he didn't confess because he didn't feel sorry for what he did. He didn't confess because he didn't want to repent. It's interesting that the prosecutor wants everyone to be rational. And he doesn't entertain the idea that someone in a murder case could just hate someone so much that they wouldn't even feel bad after they killed them, that they would even want to take down their illegitimate brothers. He's the bastard son. You don't think that he has a chip on his shoulder and that he would want to take them down with him? That prosecutor has such a triumphalist narrative that he spun, and he has such a high, human psychology that he's trying to spin. But at the end of the day, it's like you are in a murder trial and you don't think that people want to kill people and bring them down with them. I don't know. It's just, how could someone be so blind? And the defense attorney says, Dmitri is a wild beast, but he's a noble one. I wonder if, maybe C.S. Lewis read that, and when he said that Aslan he's a wild lion, not a tame lion. He's good, but he's not tame. I wonder if there's some kind of connection to be made there. But the defense, finally, it can't prove that Smerdyakov actually did it. You can just say that, we have an absence of evidence here, and it seems like, yeah, he hates his family, and he hates his family enough to kill them. And, well, he hates his father enough to kill him. He hates his brothers enough to hang them out to dry, and he hates himself enough to take himself out of the picture. Again, as we've seen with Lisa, and as we've seen with the devil, and, as we saw in Mephistopheles, evil wants to self-negate. And so should it be any surprise that, the person who kills himself before a murder trial, that maybe he was the guilty one? I don't know. I think that's a pretty convincing argument to me. So what do they say? What's the verdict? Not many people were applauding the prosecutor's thing, and they couldn't get people to be quiet after the defense attorney thing. And yet, Dimitri's found guilty, and he's sent to 20 years in the mines. Which is ironic because earlier, Madame Holikov told him that, he should think about going to the mines, to get some money, leave this whole town behind, go to the gold mines, he'll be great. And then at the end of the day, he is going to the mines. He's sentenced there. 20 years is a long time. That's most of your life for age expectancy back then. For us, it's not your entire life, but Dimitri's happy to go. He's made it clear that he is willing to go there for everyone. He's willing to be guilty for everyone, and that a new man will be born in him, when he's out there. And so, we see in the epilogue that Ivan and Katya, that they're an item, but Katya's proud heart is kind of shattering at this point. But then again, Ivan's proud mind is shattered too, so maybe they're a good fit. And they're scheming some plans to break out Dmitri. And they say that, we could break him out and smuggle him into America. And so what does Dmitri have to say about these plans that they're hatching to spare him? First of all, one thing I want to call out is that in the epilogue, where do we find Dmitri? He's in a hospital, and he's in a cot. And the cot that he is sitting in was Smerdykov's. And so it's interesting here how Dostoevsky places him, where he is literally taking the place of Smerdykov in the hospital. And so in the same hospital bed. So he is taking his place, both literally and figuratively, at the end of the novel. And so they hatch this story, the scheme, and they say like, oh, well, we can take you to America. We can smuggle you out of the mines and all of this. And then he says, this is what I've thought up and decided. If I do run away, even with money and a passport and even to America, I still take heart from the thought that I will not be running to any joy or happiness, but truly to another penal servitude, maybe no better than this one. No better, Alexei, I tell you, truly no better. This America, devil take it, I hate it already. So Grushka will be with me, but look at her. Is she an American woman? She's a Russian. Every bone of her is Russian. She'll pine for her native land, and I'll see all the time that she's pining away for my sake, and that she has taken up such a cross for my sake, and what has she done wrong? And I won't be able to stand the local rabble, though every last one of them may be better than I am. I hate this America even now, and maybe even the last one of them, some sort of boundless machinist or whatever, but devil take them. They're not my people, not of my soul. I love Russia, Alexei. I love Russian God. I love myself as a scoundrel, but there I'll just croak. So he doesn't, it's interesting that he said, I can't get away from who I am. And even if you took me to America and tried to get me out of prison, you would just be making my problem someone else's problem. And all my life will remain a wound in my soul, and I in yours, and that's how it shall be. Oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't Dmitri, but that was Katya talking to Dmitri. So she's trying to repair things with him before he goes. But yeah, as we remember from that hymn earlier on, he doesn't want to avoid his punishment, even if it's not his. He's willing to take the punishment that is given to him. And then he said, if you had killed Father, I would regret that you rejected your cross, but you're innocent, and such a cross is too much for you. You wanted to regenerate another man in yourself through suffering. I say just remember that other man always, all your life, and wherever you go and escape to, and that'll be enough for you. I'm sorry, that was Alyosha reinterpreting Dmitri's words back to him. So he knows that another man can only be born in him through suffering. So he's willing to take that suffering unto himself, however that is. So he's willing to take this suffering. He's willing to go. That's how Dmitri's story ends. That's largely how the story ends. But then we have one last thing. And just as we had a monastery court that didn't figure out the Dmitri and Fyodor case, and now we had a secular court that didn't figure out the Dmitri and Fyodor case, we are now back where we started, where we had an unorthodox family assembled from different brothers together. And now at the end, we have another unusual family with these boys who have gathered around Alyosha, and they meet by the stone after Yalushka's funeral. And again, the question is this kind of terrible stuff going to be passed on for another generation? Are these sins going to be passed on for another generation? People like Dmitri have shown us that no, I will take the blame unto myself. I will stop the cycle of accusations. I'll be willing to suffer the sins of all, so that the world may be paradise. He is willing to do that. And now Alyosha has another generation of brothers, near him. And so the question is, are they going to fare any better than he and his brothers did? And that's the question that we're left with here. And he says, you must know that there is nothing higher or stronger or sounder or more useful afterwards in life than some good memory, especially a memory from childhood, from the parental home. You hear a lot said about your education, yet some such beautiful sacred memory preserved from childhood is perhaps the best education. If a man stores up many such memories to take into life, then he is saved for his whole life. And even if one good memory remains in us, in our hearts, that alone may one day serve for our salvation. So here, he has this rousing speech, where we're going to remember Ilyushenko. We're going to remember his memory. We're going to remember how he brought us together. And even this sad moment, this early death of a child, we're going to be able to remember how it softened our hearts. It brought us together, and we grew. Kolya had that moment of reconciliation, and he brought Zhushka, the dog, back to Ilyushka and said, look, he didn't die. Once again, he didn't only forgive him for what he did to his dog, but he even gave him his dog back. These moments of wholeness and peace and reconciliation are what the whole story is working towards. It's what Dostoevsky wants us to take. He wants us to be able to reconcile with one another. He wants us to be able to take the sins of all unto ourselves. And then it's interesting that he also ends pointing out that Yalusha's body didn't have a smell. If anything, it even smelled fragrant and sweet. And so it ends on this touching moment where, there's a confirmation that there is something holy about this boy. There's something beautiful about this story, and that Dmitri, can you say that it ends in a happy way? I would say that probably most of us wouldn't want to be Dmitri, but Dmitri thinks his story ended happily. He's willing to go off to the mines and become another man. Alyosha, he seems to have ended on a happy note. He can see that he's helped these boys become, reconciled, and that he's willing to help them on in whatever might happen in volume 2 that never got written. Ivan, He's broken. He's pretty beat up. Wouldn't say that, but he's survived the story. So I don't know. What do you say? Did the brothers Karamazov end happily? Was there a good end to the story? Would you call it a comedy or a tragedy? But that's the end of the book. Um, oh, there's one last thing. I just need to say that when I read this last 2 years with my priest, he mentioned that odor is a very, like scent, is a very important sense in Dostoevsky. That you have, the smell of corruption coming from Zosima, and then you have the holy smell, the fragrant smell coming from Ilusha. And he really kind of riffed on this. And then I just said, oh, is that why they call him Fyodor? All right, so I needed to get that pun in before I close off the stream. So I'm sorry if you're all groaning off camera right now, but I thought Fyodor is really funny. So I'm sorry to get to this triumphant note and then give you a pun to end on. But please write any other questions that you have. How did this book go for you? Do you see any lessons that you can take into your own life? Are there any quotes that stand out to you? In the meantime, I'll also just point out that our next book that we're going to cover is Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. Not super long. We're going to stretch it out over 2 months. So it's a leisurely introduction to Nietzsche. It's a leisurely introduction to summer reading. I'm going to be covering a lot of these aphorisms and his philosophy. I'm going to see how his understanding of freedom relates to Dostoevsky's notions of freedom that we've come across in this book. After that, we're going to get into Middlemarch, and that'll be more of our summer into fall reading. And we're going to stretch that out. That's our summer big read. And then this one is, we're going to cover notions of sympathy, relating to other people, how there are love triangles, and how we relate to one another. Very philosophical novel, really great. Then we're going to do Till We Have Faces in the fall and see whether or not Oriol can forgive the gods, forgive her sister, and maybe even forgive herself for the life that she's living and how she deals with grief. And it's just a phenomenal book. And finally, ending the year on Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, which are really short. It's his centenary this year of his passing. And then this will also be a good way for you to maybe look at your own art and your own creativity, your own writing. I always find something new from this, and I'm constantly reading it. But in the meantime, I have a few more essays that I need to write for you for Dostoevsky. So we've finished the discussion here, where I gave you, a walkthrough of everything that was happening in part 4. I gave you a little commentary along the way, and then I'm going to polish these thoughts into essays and send them off to you so that you can read them this month. And then we're going to have a conversation at the end of this month on the last Saturday of the month at I think 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then if you're still processing Dostoevsky, where it's a giant book, so I assume that you are, or if you're just cracking Nietzsche and getting into him, it's, our members chat. So you're welcome to just hop on. And even if you're not reading any of those books, you can just hop on and tell me what else you're reading, what you're writing, what you're thinking about, what's interesting. Meet some other subscribers. And yeah, it's been the highlight of my month to get to meet some of you face to face. So I'd love for you to join at the end of the month. Um, but yeah, congratulations to you for finishing the Brothers Karamazov. If you're still working on it, again, I'll have companion essays that are coming out to you during this month so that you can keep digesting it. And then feel free to revisit those essays, throughout the year or anytime you want to pick up the book again. It's been such an honor to read this book with you, to think about it so much, to write a commentary on it, and to share that with you. And I'm looking forward to doing so many more books with you over the rest of the year. So there's nothing else. That's all for me. So thanks everyone for joining tonight. Thanks for reading with me, and I look forward to talking to you soon. All right. Have a good one.